Okay, this is going to be my presentation over learner variability for SPED 507. For the unit that I am doing, I chose religion. I chose to do a course from case study A. The course that I'm using is going to be a Supreme Court elective. And this unit is going to take place at the end of the year, April 22nd. Uh, it's going to be a course over the religion, and it's going to be a course over the Supreme Court, but specifically the unit will be over religious issues in the Supreme Court. And so that's where we're going to begin. For the overview, I went with case study A, which had many track students that were going to be missing class, a predominantly suburban setting, access to technology for all students. And I went ahead and defined, since the variable wasn't given, that it would be juniors and seniors predominantly. I know that there was a student with autism on the autism spectrum, and students with ADHD, and some students that struggle with literacy. Luckily, the content area gives us a lot of different ways that we can make up for that, and so I'm going to go ahead and talk about that. For assessment, I'm going to be using formative assessment exit slips at the end of every week, but they will. And then I'm also going to be using that to monitor the progress. Predominantly, I really believe in database learning. Or, I mean, not database learning, but rather database tracking. And trying to remember it. Okay. In the monitor that project article that we read earlier on in the semester is a really good example of some of the stuff. Monitor that progress that we read earlier on in the semester is a really good example of that. So what I'm primarily going to be doing is using exit slips at the end of all of the 2.5-hour class periods to see where students are in understanding the content material, and then adjust appropriately. The unit will be 2 weeks long. Okay, so as far as engagement, now obviously there are a couple of different struggles here. Students with ADHD aren't going to want to sit around and listen to me lecture on Supreme Court cases for an hour. So I tried to do a good job of splitting up the coursework with about 15 or 20 minutes of video during my short hours. 15 to 20 minutes of lecture discussion, and then 10 minutes of group work. The summative assessment for this unit is going to be a group work case study over a Supreme Court decision over a religious issue that would be assigned to them at the beginning. I am providing the opportunity for students to work individually, which might be helpful with the case of the student on the autism spectrum. My 2.5-hour periods, I try to still split it up. They start off with 30 minutes of group work to hopefully get them engaged and working on their final project. Again, if they're working individually, that would be individual work. There'll be 20 minutes of lecture discussion over general concepts, 30 minutes of individual work online over a case study that day that they will need to be writing a summary on, and then finally we'll finish up with a 60-minute discussion of the case study. So it's going to be a total of 90 minutes spent on one case study, but these are going to be really important issues in the Supreme Court history, so things like Smith v. Oregon, and the Sherbert and Lemon test, things that really decide the role of government in the rights of the individual. For the non-block sessions, I am going to be front loading, so sort of con method type thing with VoiceThread, and I'm going to be using Poll Everywhere during the class periods for formative assessment. If you're not familiar with Poll Everywhere, it's a website where students in a BYOD environment can input answers to teachers' questions, and I can use it not only to track data, but to also to keep students engaged by allowing them to use their own devices. It promotes student autonomy. And then for digital recordings and podcasts will be available online. Everything that I do is going to be recorded and available online, not just for the benefit of the students, but also for the benefit of the parents. As this is a suburban setting, I am anticipating that many of the students will have help at home, and probably educated parents that might be able to assist them, although the content is probably going to be unfamiliar to both of them, as the Supreme Court does not receive a lot of focus in social studies curriculum. So that's sort of my rationale here. One last thing I'd like to mention when it comes to engagement. My student with autism obviously is going to have a lot of difficulty relating to what is predominantly a social issue. There are very concrete scientific elements to this, and so to assist him, what I would like to do, ideally, is to set up some sort of timeline that sort of monitors the the trend of the Supreme Court towards government power versus individual freedom, sort of putting it in an almost quantitative way. And I actually might provide that as an alternative assessment for him, depending on what the IEPs would specifically call for. That way, it's a little bit more concrete and quantitative rather than qualitative, and I think that might be something that would be helpful. Now, as far as expression, the assessment is going to be pretty bare bones. It's going to be project based, and the students will have a lot of freedom, just like in a lot of the classes that we've taken here at university. The option to present podcasts, visually express the case. As an example, there is a really famous Supreme Liberty religious liberty case in which the Wampanoag, one of the first Native American tribes that we interacted with, had a problem with a windmill farm that was blocking their view of the sun, and they considered themselves the people of the dawn, and so sunlight was holy to them. So, I mean, even demonstrating the issue of the case and then the decision of the court visually, that's something that they have freedom to do, and so I do definitely want to make that something that's available. Similarly, I think that the representation needs to certainly, given anything in the social studies, needs to take into account the the cultural sensitivity of the individual, and that is a form of learner variability, even if it isn't the cognitive and behavioral variability that we discuss in special education courses. And for advice on that, I did turn to Chapter 2 of Alverman's content area in reading and literacy. A lot of these case studies are going to be targeted towards the kind of conflict between the predominant majority of people in the United States, which are white Christians, and minority religions that have liberty issues. And then lastly, going back to the engagement piece really quickly, I have looked at both Critical Literacy and Social Studies by Wolk, which was published in the Social Studies in 2010, and then also Amby's Journal of Adolescent Adult Amby's article on inviting reluctant leaders in the Journal of Adolescent and Adult Literacy, published in 2007. Both of which talk about engaging students in different ways, and I think that the cultural issue, even though this is a white suburban school, is going to be a really kind of a crux of my engagement, because when I design curriculum, I thread through issues of diversity and conflict between groups, and in doing so, you can create a sort of conflict narrative that I think is really engaging and pulls in students across different cultural backgrounds. And so that's really sort of a key thread to my engagement piece that isn't necessarily expressed explicitly in every single one of my activities. Okay, let me go forward. And then finally, you'll notice that I split this presentation up along UDL lines. So my last bit is going to be representation, and for this I went with I did some research on the importance of visual messages, in an article by David M. Constantine, and I used my own existing knowledge of the availability of Supreme Court recordings. There are recordings of virtually every single Supreme Court case past 1950, and access to a variety of different graphics that might be helpful for the students. So things like artist renditions of the court cases, photos of the people, and there is a great article on visual literacy in the social studies. That's the Constantine article that I already cited. It's about essentially using visual primary sources to help teach social studies, because we can often get bogged down in the written elements, and so that's something that I'm hoping to avoid here. Also, and this at this point, I feel like it goes without saying, the beginning of the unit will be introduced with a graphic organizer. That's something that I've really taken away from this class, and that particularly Candace's presentations have really grounded into me, that I really believe in strongly. So there will be a graphic organizer that ties in all of the overall unit themes back to the central idea, and that's something that I'm really hoping to use. Lastly, I want to just go over some of the specific issues in the case studies and talk about how I'll be addressing them. For students with ADHD, I try to split up, with the exception of the block schedules, which I don't. I'm not a particular fan of block scheduling because I think that it lends itself to teacher creativity, but in a lot of ways ignores the needs of the students who don't necessarily want to be in the same room for 2.5 hours. I don't, and I'm in college. So for the students with ADHD, I do try to break up the activities and keep them from doing one consistent thing for too long. Obviously, with block scheduling, there's a certain amount of inevitability there. The student with autism spectrum disorder, again, going back to that, I think that presenting it as a logical long-term quantitative study over variance in court attitude versus individual the court attitude towards the power of the government versus the freedom of the individual puts it in a more scientific, concrete way that might be easier for that student to deal with. And for the track runners and the students that are gone, I intend to that's what the front loading is for with the voice thread. They'll have access to the lectures online, and again, the podcasts and digital recordings of my lectures will be available both for them and for their students, so that any missed classroom time can be made up with during personal study. The students in case are not poor performers. They are about average run of the mill, what you might expect. So hopefully, with a little bit extra work, they'll be able to keep them up. With all athletes, you have the motivational factor of the necessity of maintaining a high GPA in order to participate in activities, and so that's going to be something that's working in my favor here. As far as the behavioral issues with students with ADHD, something that has worked very well in my fieldwork has been the use of ability grouping and giving leadership roles to students that might normally be distractions, by giving them an outlet for their hyperactivity. They can it minimizes not only distractions for them but also for other students. So ability grouping is going to be my strongest asset there. Lastly, I want to talk about the suburban setting because throughout the course I've mentioned that I find technological uses untenable. I understand that the frequency of BYOD environments is cropping up, and I'm heavily dependent upon that with the large number of web resources and visual and audio resources that I'm making available to the students, as well as the integration not only of Poll Everywhere but of VoiceThread. I also don't believe in teaching in a classroom that is ignorant or operates within a vacuum of the student's own cultural background, and so for this class, the students are going to be very keenly aware of the fact that they're part of the majority, that the First Amendment, which again, as this is a unit on religious issues, the First Amendment is there to protect religious minorities from the majority. They're going to be aware of how their cultural background might play into that, and that's going to be something that I'm going to play up to hopefully increase the engagement. That's sort of a controversial decision because it can be potentially offensive to some people, but I found from my own personal experience that students have preconceived notions about what America is and what America means to most people, and there's been pretty consistent research showing that students within that come from privileged suburban settings are more understanding of their own privilege than white students who belong to the same, who fall within the same sort of ethno-cultural centric viewpoint of most mainstream curriculum that don't have that same privilege, because it's a sharper contrast. They understand that they have things and then other groups might not, and so that's something that I really want to play up and hopefully increase engagement with. This is overall what I'm going with. I hope that I have done a pretty good job of explaining it, and if there are any other questions, please just let me know.